Vasco, great to have you joining us today. Just to kick off, what should our listeners know about you, your background, and Dotfile?
Hi, Steve. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Dotfile. We've been in business for around 4 years. We are based in Paris and in London. And Dotfile is a SaaS platform that helps financial institutions verify their counterparties anywhere in the world. So our mission is really to help financial innovation by making compliance effortless. And we try to consolidate into a single platform all the capabilities that our client need for KYC, KYB, and AML duties. And we've been fortunate enough to work with around 80 clients now in 12 countries.
Well, I can't think of anyone better to help us navigate what can seem like on the surface quite a complex world of business registration and an AML framework in France. So I'd really like to start with maybe just a general overview of the French registry system, if that's okay. And I suppose, unlike some of the other countries we've covered so far on the pod, France is unusual in that it's historically had a number of individual registers or individual courts which you'd need to consult potentially if you were looking to verify a business. So, just to give us a general flavour, what can you tell us generally about France, and where would I start to look if I wanted to go about verifying a company?
Yeah, so sure. It all started with the RCS. So the RCS is the Trade and Business Register. It was maintained by the local commercial registers and courts, and this is the one that provides the legal existence and disclosure of companies. And even today, it remains the primary legal source. And then in 1973, you had the INSEE, which is like this large public institution that produces statistics in France, such as unemployment data, for instance, that created the SIREN system. And so this is when businesses started to have a unique identifier. So that would be the SIREN number. So that's a 9-digit number that precisely identify each company from an administrative standpoint. And you also have its counterpart, the SIRET number, that identifies each establishment of a company. So that's when we started to have really this unique number to identify businesses. And slightly before, in 1978, you had the BODAC. So the BODAC is more about the official publications, the official announcements. So the BODAC was meant to cover public notices of major corporate events. So you can think of incorporations, liquidations, mergers, sales of business assets, and so on. So you had the INSEE and BODAC on the other end that were producing data. And then in 2015, you had a reform initiated by President Macron, where INPI took the lead. So INPI was the National Institute for Industrial Property in France. And this law made INPI responsible for really centralizing all company data together. And from 2019, this is when they decided to open source this data. So France had those open data efforts where they try to make accessible as much of the data possible. And that's when they created this URL data.inpi.fr, where you could access freely business data. So this is really what's marking the attempt of creating a single and unique register. There's another institution that you should know about, and which is called Infogreffe. Infogreffe is a bit of a different one. So it's actually the official portal for the group of commercial court registries. And it was the first digital storefront of registries, and that was owned and operated by the courts, themselves. So this is a little bit of the landscape. You have INPI on one hand, you have Infogreffe on the other end, and these are really the two main sources at the moment.
Well, I think you've already helped clarify what's a pretty common question I get, and I'm sure many of our listeners will have had if they're trying to navigate the French system, which is I think you do a Google search for French business registry and you come up with multiple results. You've got Infogreffe, you've got INPI, how they sit together, what information is offered by both can seem a little bit confusing. Now, maybe one thing I wanted to dig into there, you talked about a specific innovation in the SIREN number. and how early that occurred. One thing I think is often highlighted about the French system as well is that you've almost got a piece of information that's offered that it is an attempt to provide an identity document for businesses, which is this KBIS document that's offered by the Infogreffe. I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's a good point. So first of all, if we start with the data that's available through INPI, this data is free. The API is, pretty modern, fairly well documented. If I had to do a comparison, maybe I would draw a comparison to Companies House and the UK registers. The UX is far better than what you can have with InfoCam, for instance. But there are some limitations. And one limitation that you rightly pointed out is that you are not able to get the CABIS, the original and most trusted register of incorporations, through Infogreffe, through INPI, sorry. This is still something that you need to get through Infogreffe. So I would say that would be one of the limitations. But otherwise, through INPI, you are still able to get documents as well as data. And among the documents that you can find on INPI are the articles of association, the annual accounts, if they've been published, and so on. But yes, Infogreffe remains essential for this last bit of information that is the CABIS.
What I thought was quite interesting about the KBIS, specifically for the use case we're talking about, is that we often talk about the fact that registers have these different stakeholders that are trying to access information. So I suppose first and foremost, you've got the businesses themselves that are registering, the obliged entities, so businesses that have to verify other business details for some regulatory reason. It could be because of anti-money laundering law, that could be something else, are kind of not really considered when it comes to how best to access that information. So I thought it was interesting that there is this document which really exists as a business identity in some respects, is how I've seen it referred to. And also, as you rightly said, I guess a really positive thing on the INPI side as well is that when that register was planned and launched, making data available and making it available in a structured format seemed to be really central to that project.
So yes, it was definitely. It wasn't only smooth sailing, however. So for instance, we are still noticing discrepancies in terms of usage. Today, lawyers, notaries, and some banks are still heavily referring to Infogreffe instead of INPI, because at times there are some minor discrepancies, and Infogreffe being the emanation of the court clerks themselves, it is considered as the most trusted source. And I agree with you on the CABIS document. I think it's a great step forward. However, probably if you're an AML professional, there's another document that is interesting for you, which is the UBO registry extract. And this document is far more complex to access.
Well, certainly really would like to cover the UBO environment with you, and it's something we've been talking about a lot on this podcast, specifically in relation to EU member states. So, we'll come on to that point in a bit as well. You started to touch on, I think, maybe some of the criticisms of the French registry system. So, actually, if we just summarise the positives, so you've got an attempt to really centralise what historically has been some fragmented business registers through the INPI portal. We talked about the KBIS, we talked about there being structured data available, but again, still on a journey in terms of that transition and knowing which information you should trust. Let's just broaden out that last point a little bit. And how much verification or enforcement does the French registry do on the quality of the data itself? If I'm an analyst using this information for KYB, should I be trusting it? Is it something I can rely on?
Yeah, for the most part, yes. I would say that if reliability is really the primary concern, then Infogreffe remains the most trusted source because it is operated by the clerk. Again, INPI is not the register themselves. They're only displaying and making the information accessible to the public and to AML professional. But behind the RCS and also the RNE, remains the key entity. So in terms of reliability, I think that Infogreffe still has a lead, and we will have to see how does the the merger ultimately is completed, and whether we will see deprecation of Infogreffe at some point, because yes, there is this kind of double standard that can be confusing for professionals.
Yeah, and I think anyone that has worked in any kind of technology company knows that launching a new platform, it seems like a lot of work, but it's actually quite a nice thing to do, and you get the plaudits with that. But if you're transitioning from an old platform to a new platform, probably the hardest bit is cutting free that old platform and getting your existing users to migrate over and start using that new one. So yeah, we've seen it. We've seen it with other countries we've covered on this podcast as well, and certainly seems like there's a fair bit of work to be done on that side. Let's go back to UBO data for a second, and while we're talking about verification and trustworthiness of the information, I found it really interesting that there was an investigation by Transparency International and the Anti-Corruption Data Collective in 2023 that suggested that almost a third of French legal entities had failed to file the beneficial ownership declarations. They're really in contravention of the mandate that was set down by the fourth anti-money laundering directive. What's your view on why that's happened, and how generally, I guess, the French business environment has responded to some of these UBO changes?
Yeah, I think it's true that this obligation is not always enforced. That's a fact. There is also the fact that companies and financial institutions have this obligation of report any discrepancy that they would notice between the situation of one of their counterparty and what they're actually filing in the finding in the register. And I know that this last obligation is something that financial institutions are still grappling with, and there's definitely more work to be done around that. Besides this, if we compare the European registers, I would say that France had a pretty good access in terms of UBO data. And that was, of course, before the decision of the CJEU about the publicity of UBO information. And this is something that France acted upon around 6 months ago. So 6 months ago, this is where we noticed the shift, and that the UBO information was not as easily accessible as before.
It took a while, didn't it, for the CJEU ruling really to take effect in France. You could continue to access those UBO declarations for quite a long period, actually. Unlike, for example, countries like Ireland, where access was switched off to the public pretty much within hours, actually, of that ruling taking effect. And then we've seen, as of last year and recently taken effect, that this introduction of a process for legitimate interest to be determined. So there's now a form I think you can submit in line with some of the processes happening at other registries as well, to allow businesses to declare their legitimate interest and give some supporting evidence on that front as well.
It's not too dissimilar from what we can observe in other countries, such as Germany. So it's still the same API. It's just that the level of your account need to be upgraded. And in terms of who can claim legitimate interest, here we're noticing that the ruling is consistently applied across the EU, and that essentially to demonstrate a legitimate interest, you need to be subject to AML yourself, which can pose problems for companies like ours that are in the business of selling software to help financial institutions be compliant, because only financial institutions that are themselves subject to AML, according to terms that are defined in the French monetary code, can access the register. There are some nuances and intermediary levels that exist where you can still claim access, but there are some information that are still partial, such as birth dates, for instance. You wouldn't get the full birth date, but this is more of an edge case.
Yeah, and it's something we and Kyckr, and I'm sure you at Dotfile have been tracking very closely as well, is this kind of emerging conversation around, okay, well, yes, there's organizations that are regulated under anti-money laundering convention, and they certainly have legitimate interest. But actually, what are the ancillary companies, be they technology providers, consultants, that also should be wrapped into that as well? And I think our initial response was, we'd be a little bit shocked, that perhaps wasn't considered to start with when it came to the rollout of the changes post the ruling. What's very interesting, and this is actually something we haven't talked about on the podcast before, because it's a fairly recent change, is that in some of the latest updates to the Sixth Anti-Money Laundering Directive, it does talk about establishing that technology providers acting on behalf of obliged entities are legitimate interest and do have a reason to access that information on their customers' behalf. But I think to wrap that into your point, what we're certainly waiting to see, and there's been very little discussion of this so far, is actually how that will be applied, and particularly how it will be standardized across the EU. Because if you look across those member states, there are some similarities in processes, but we also see some pretty big differences across the EU in what information needs to be submitted, how much scrutiny, I guess, is applied to the process on which you distribute that information as well. So be interested to get your opinion, maybe a little bit of opening up again occurring, but I suppose, with still some unanswered questions around how that process will work going forward.
No, it's true that this decision from the CJEU was frustrating for both of us, and I think it was frustrating for a lot of AML professionals. And similarly, we have in France this long tradition of investigative journalism. And so there were publications in Le Monde and other major news outlets in France saying, well, this is really a setback in terms of the investigation and for transparency overall. And so I was definitely on this side of the argument. And then a couple of things happened in France over the past few months. We had some company leaders or company founders that have suffered from violent abductions, namely some CEOs of prominent Bitcoin companies, because kidnappers were under the assumption that they could give them access to significant amount of cryptocurrencies, and the investigations are still ongoing, but this really made national news. And one of the assumptions that was made is that the kidnappers used and leveraged information that was found in the public company registers. So it's just to kind of balance the argument, and what the CJEU essentially told when they issued that ruling is that this can pose legitimate privacy risk and privacy concerns. And I guess that those aggressions were an example of that. So I tend to be and to have a little bit more of a balanced position now.
Yeah, well, I'm really pleased you've given those examples, because I think you can fall into a trap big on this side of the problem or the challenge, if you like, to think that transparency is always a good thing. And I think I would admit that our initial reaction, as I said earlier, was probably one of shock to the ruling and thinking it was maybe a step backwards in terms of financial transparency. Well, that may be true in some respects, but as you said, there are equally good arguments as to why having complete transparency of that information, particularly when it's personally identifiable information that's in any other walk of life you would expect to be highly restricted, that can cause problems, and there's a reasonable expectation to privacy. So it does seem, I mean, it seems to me when I talk to others in our market and to journalists as well, I have to say that there is almost an emerging consensus that the EU is probably got it about right now, and from a policy perspective, they're trying to thread a very difficult position, which is how they preserve citizens' rights to privacy, but also make the lives of our users easier and those working in financial crime. But I think the interesting point will be, and where I would expect there's going to be some pretty fierce debate, will be what the process looks like of obtaining access, if indeed you do have that legitimate interest, how that's governed, how privacy is maintained as well. Because, as we all know, different organizations have different levels of information security. That extends to governments as well. And I'm sure it won't be too long before, sadly, there is some kind of leak or at least the accusation that this information has been leaked in some way.
Yeah, and in a way, I understand where they're coming from. So, obviously, it would be great if technology providers such as ourselves could be included. But in the meantime, we need to think about the verification efforts, the vetting efforts that we need, that would be required to verify, the access of all those companies. And you can imagine some actors just having an online storefront and being able to get access for malicious purposes. So the verification is not easy to do, I imagine.
Just sticking on the topic of UBOs for a second, and maybe diving into just company ownership generally in France. What does the direct investment landscape look like? Do we see many foreign-owned companies in France? And if so, which countries do those ownership structures tend to lead to?
That's a good question. I think that France is a very diversified economy, so you tend to see, companies with ownership that are very diverse. This is a strength that we have. So obviously, it's a challenge for a male professional, and I think it's really the heart of the problem here, because one piece of the equation is, okay, how do I manage to find ownership information for French companies? But what about if the ownership chain has a mix of companies that are both domestic and foreign? So this is really where the challenges start, and where financial institutions may rely on external solutions, because this investigative work of piecing together the information between domestic registers, foreign registers that each have different access level is the one that is really burdensome.
Yeah, and actually, there's an interesting challenge specifically in France, which we should talk about as well. And we've both worked on this, and we've collaborated on solutions to help with that challenge of looking at foreign ownership and uncovering that. Now, actually, what came up in the research, and when I was speaking to our product team about this, is you can actually get some shareholder data in France separately from the ultimate beneficial ownership register. So Infogreffe does have some shareholder data, but I think, as far as I'm aware, that is coming from essentially submissions to the Gazette, if we want to call it that. So filings that the companies are made. So what you tend to find is, unlike other countries, for example, Germany or Netherlands, where you can see the intermediate ownership of companies rather than the ultimate ownership, but you can see that full picture and make some determinations. It's quite challenging, because often the shareholder data has some pretty big gaps in it. If a company hasn't filed any changes to a shareholding for 10, 15 years, then you're kind of at the mercy of what data they have filed and whether or not that's accurate. So yeah, it definitely seems like a specific challenge where technology's got a role to play in perhaps pulling in other data sources, across France and the rest of the EU as well, to help with some of that more complex ownership verification.
Yeah, like in other countries, what the most thorough AML professionals will end up doing is confronting the data in itself and also the documents. And so essentially merging both to get to the ultimate source of truth. So that's an exercise that is still done in France as well.
Well, I think we're pretty much at time. So I just want to wrap up by saying thank you for your time, Vasco, and for your insights. Really, really useful to hear from someone on the ground about how the system looks. How can our listeners connect with Dotfile if they'd like to get in touch with you personally?
Dotfile.com or on my LinkedIn directly. And maybe something that I should have said during the introduction is that Dotfile orchestrates many data sources, including Register, and that we have now a long-standing partnership with Kyckr. So Kyckr data is also available in Dotfile.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned it, and an example of great technology meeting good data and also documentation when needed as well. It's a mixed bag that's required, I think, to overcome some of these data challenges that exist, as we've talked about. So thank you, Vasco, and thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in as well. If you've enjoyed this episode, you can check out the back catalogue of more than 30 episodes and follow Kyckr on the platform of your choice. We'd love for you to share the podcast on LinkedIn, tell a colleague about it, give us a 5-star rating on your podcast app as well. Really helps us get the message out there and continue making episodes about other registries as well. On that note, if there are registries you'd like us to cover that we haven't already, contact us via LinkedIn as well. Your host for this episode was me, Steve. Registries Revealed is a Kyckr production, and you can visit kyckr.com for more information about Kyckr as well. Bye for now.